Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken with the Mises Institute. And with me today is Jonathan Newman, and he's one of our top fellows and economists here at the Mises Institute. And this week we're going to talk a bit about gold and the gold reserve, the gold at Fort Knox, and why is that gold there and why bother with gold? And this comes up because there's been a lot of discussion in recent weeks about this proposed audit of the gold reserve, mostly with the focus on the gold at Fort Knox. And there's a question of, well, is the gold actually there? You know, federal bureaucrats, they're just obsessed with keeping secrets even when they don't have to. So they don't even want to tell us if the gold's there, where is it, what's going on with it. And there hasn't been an audit for decades. And so Doge is now saying, hey, maybe we should find out how much is there. So there's been a whole bunch of commentary around, especially in the gold world, right? People who sell gold, people who think about gold a lot, who talk up gold. And some people call them gold bugs. Here at the Mises Institute, we like gold. We're fine with gold. But really our angle is private money. We just want money that's out of the hands of government. Could be gold, could be something else. But let's talk about that a little bit
First
today.
of all, isn't it suspicious that they won't even let sitting U.S. senators go into Fort Knox?
That
take
seems
a look around?
weird.
It is. It's very strange.
I mean, and I wonder if it is due to the fact that they really have a secret, or if they're just such knee-jerk bureaucrats in the sense of, I don't want anybody checking up on me. Right? Because they regard answering an email with 5 questions of what you did last week as this horrible imposition. How dare you?
Well, one thing I did is I refused a sitting U.S. senator to come in and see what's going on inside this army base.
Right. Right. I think they think that is like, well, I'm tending to my kingdom. I'm preventing these outsiders from coming in, even though the elected government is supposed to be in charge of that stuff. Yeah, I agree. It's weird. Certainly, if you're a federal bureaucrat and that strikes you as something you should be doing, well, shame on you. That's all I can say. But I think the question that maybe we should address starting off is, how did all that gold end up there? Why does the U.S. have like this big gold reserve in the first place? And now it's just sitting on this stuff that may or may not have to the amount that it claims, and that it won't let the elected government look at. Like, why is it even there? Did it buy it at some point? Help our listeners understand why there's a gold reserve in the first place.
Well, as you mentioned in one of your articles, it's all the gold inside of Fort Knox. It's if we did an audit of it, it would be like documenting crimes. It'd be like the auditors would be historians of crimes. And the reason why is because much of the gold, I don't know exactly how much, but much of it was confiscated from U.S. citizens. So going back to 1933, FDR unconstitutionally, illegally, unethically confiscated all U.S. privately owned gold. I think there were maybe some exceptions, like you could keep a pair of earrings or something like that, but all the coins basically were confiscated. And, shortly after that, the FDR revalued the gold at $35 an ounce, whereas before it had been just above 20. So we sometimes talk about whether or not the U.S. has ever defaulted. And of course, this is a great example of the U.S. defaulting. First of all, it's just, plain theft to go out and take everybody's gold, but then to turn around and revalue it at $35 an ounce as opposed to what it was before, just north of $20. It shows that the U.S. government has defaulted plenty of times before. Every single time that it goes back on some prior agreement regarding the exchange ratio between these numbers of green pieces of paper that are redeemable for a certain amount of gold, it's a default. We might call it a soft default because it's not Uncle Pennybags pulling his pockets out saying I can't I don't have the U.S. dollars to pay. Of course, since we have a money printer, they'll always be able to pay their debts in that way. But in a real sense, we've had numerous defaults, and of course, the gold confiscation that resulted in all of the gold that's held by the U.S. government today is one of those.
Well, and I mean, a partial default's a default, right? I mean, you come back if you did this on your mortgage, right? And you're like, I tell you what, guys, I'm not going to stop paying the mortgage, but I'm just going to pay you back 80 cents on the dollar. How about that? Right? Everyone would know that's a default, right?
Yep,
That you're
yep.
not paying your bills. So that's what the gold default essentially was. Is it's okay, we're not going to give you your gold, right? You paid for war bonds that were supposed to be. This is part of the default that occurred in the 30s, right, under FDR. Is people had war bonds that were in the contract supposed to be paid back in gold. FDR says, "Nah, we're not going to pay those back in gold. We'll pay you back in dollars," which was essentially we'll pay you back a certain number of pennies on that dollar because the dollar was worth less than it would have been worth if it had been paid off in actual gold. And then the same was true where the feds were like, yeah, well, we're going to confiscate your gold, but we will give you dollars in exchange for it. It just wasn't enough dollars to be really worth the gold trade. And so, of course, it was a partial default and essentially confiscation in many ways. And so it seems that a lot of that gold is now in this gold reserve. But there was another default, right, in 1971 also, because right, even after they told the Americans you can't get gold for your dollars anymore, foreigners could still get, well, at least foreign central banks, foreign governments could still get gold for their paper money, right? But then all that ended in 1971 with the Nixon thing, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the Bretton Woods system is what you're describing. It was set up right after World War II. And the idea was even though the U.S. government had prohibited its citizens from redeeming dollars for gold, it was going to make this promise to all the other countries in the world. It's okay for you to use the U.S. dollar as this reserve currency. It's okay for you to use this piece of paper that we have the authority to print, and we will redeem those dollars for gold on demand. And so that was the system that was set up in place after World War II. And of course, it was foreign governments and foreign central banks that had that ability, not private citizens. But then, of course, we had more wars. We had lots and lots of government spending. We had great society programs. And so the U.S. was printing up all of this money to fund all of these extravagant programs. And countries were starting to, worry, am I going to be able to it turns into a hungry hippo game, right? Am I going to be able to get the gold out of the U.S., redeem my dollars for gold before everybody else does? Because now there's way more dollars than there was gold in the gold reserves in the U.S. And so there was this famous case. I haven't looked into the details, but apparently France was so worried that they sent warships over to collect their gold because they were worried about being able to get the gold. But in 1971, Nixon, of course, he scapegoated the international money speculators, I think was his exact term, for causing wild swings in exchange rates and depreciation of the dollar, all these things. And so he temporarily suspended the gold window. He said it was going to be a temporary suspension, and of course it's still in effect today. Nobody around the world can redeem dollars for gold. And it's that's an even larger default. We were talking about defaults before. It's a huge default. The U.S. government had said we'll redeem your dollars for gold, but now we're not.
So it was a multi-stage ripoff, basically, right? So the federal government had all of this gold that they had used in an active way, right? When you had a functioning gold standard, whether it was like the classical gold standard, right, where ordinary people, mostly banks, could exchange dollars for gold, and some people would actually want gold instead of dollars, and a dollar bill could, in fact, be turned in, and you would get gold in exchange. And then that all ended, and that was stage one in a sense. And then, all foreigners? No. Even though the Bretton Woods system explicitly said that foreigners would be able to exchange for gold. No, that's stage two of the ripoff. So we got all this gold that we're now just sitting on and hoarding after we ripped it off from ordinary Americans. And now we've got the gold of foreigners who had that they were owed gold because of the money that they held because of Bretton Woods, and now we're saying we're going to take all that and sit on that too. And so then it just seems that all just froze up. That we took this gold and now it's just sitting there doing nothing. And it
Allegedly.
seems that it's all sitting there as reported in amounts reported in the official numbers, and nothing's done with that now. But it came out of like a real system that was active, where that gold that the U.S. Treasury controlled, and really functionally the central bank at the time, that it was there for a purpose, that it was exchanged, it went in and out. It wasn't like this hoard that the government sat upon. So it's like a constant reminder that the gold standard existed. But I know that a lot of people would say, well, so they ended the gold standard and everything's fine. So why even bother with that stuff? And so, I mean, I guess a kind of a side discussion on this is, well, why did we ever bother with that sort of thing? Why did people demand that there be this system where the gold went in and out and you could still exchange dollars for gold? And why was it such a revolutionary thing where the federal government comes along and says, yeah, you don't get any of this more. It's now all paper money now. I think people maybe just, it's been long enough that people are now kind of forgotten what a huge deal that was. You got to talk to 90-year-olds who remember that to really discuss it. But I mean, give us a sense of like the way it was supposed to function. Then when people actually saw gold as like the real measure of wealth and money, rather than just the dollars that we mostly look to now.
Yeah, the short answer is we had an international gold standard. I mean, it was around the world, and it lasted in various forms for centuries, right? And so the reason why people used gold as money, considered gold to be money, and in fact, when etymologically, if you look at the units of currency that we refer to today, like the dollar or the pound, earlier these referred to specific weights of a precious metal. And so going back, I know this turned into a longer answer, but the short answer is that this is the money that the market chose. People chose to use gold and silver as money, and the reason why is because it's what they demanded. It's what the market chose. We can talk about the Mengerian theory of the origins of money, which says that in barter conditions, like think primitive times, before recorded history, when people were just exchanging goods for direct use, you can imagine that it would be very difficult to get what you want from the market. So suppose you bring something to market that there's not a lot of buyers, not a lot of people who want to purchase this thing, but there's one particular item that you want from the market. And so you have to overcome what's called the double coincidence of wants problem. And which means you have to find somebody who wants what you have, and that person also has to have what you want as well. That's the double coincidence of wants. And so in barter or direct exchange, that's a huge hurdle to get what you want out of the market. And so Menger says that people noticed that some goods were more saleable than others. That was his term in German, saleable or marketable. It's easier to buy and sell certain things than it is others. I mean, he used the example of like surgical instruments and astronomical tools or something like that as examples of things that are not marketable, and he contrasted it with commodities like corn and cotton, which are marketable. And so you can imagine that somebody has this bright idea. Hey, instead of trying to go through direct exchange, find somebody who has what I want, maybe I will trade with somebody who wants what I have, but they're selling something that is more saleable, something that's easier for me to go find another buyer. And that way I can then use that item to go get the thing that I actually want. And so once somebody realizes that and goes through that process, they've used a medium of exchange. They're using they're using a good that they don't want for direct use, just so that they can exchange it in a second transaction to get what they actually want. So that's the birth of a medium of exchange. And then Menger and Mises and Rothbard, they've all explained how once the market realizes that certain goods are good at performing that function, then the demand for it increases, which means it becomes even more marketable. So you get this, some people might call it like a network effect, where everybody's using this thing because everybody's using this thing. And we can look throughout human history, really, and what emerged as sort of the superior, the primary medium of exchange that's used around the world for thousands of years is precious metals. I know I've been talking for a while, but I've been looking at the particular history of ancient Mesopotamia. And the reason why is because we're getting ready for the Austrian Economics Research Conference, which is coming up next weekend. If you're interested, you can check out some of the lectures will be live streamed and made public, but the paper presentations won't. You'll have to actually come to our campus to maybe next year to see these papers presented if you're interested in this sort of thing. But what I'm going to present is about this debate between the Chartalists and the Mengerian theory. So the Chartalists say that no, money is a creature of the state. State authorities decide that they're going to collect something in taxes, and then by nature of that proclamation, people start to demand it so that they can pay their taxes, and that's how money originates. So the Chartalists and MMTers, the modern monetary theory people, are on the same page regarding the origins of money. And one thing that some of these authors point to is the clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia. They say that there are these clay tablets that like temple administrators, state administrators would use to record transactions, record taxes and debts. And they claim that these things were used as money. They were exchanged. And so I look at L. Randall Wray, and I look at A. Mitchell Innes, I think is how you pronounce his name. And they don't cite any historical research on these clay tablets. Nothing. They just make these claims, and there's really no way for another scholar to go back and say, okay, well, let's see what they're citing. They just say, yes, they were exchanged. Yes, these were money. And so I took it upon myself to actually look at the historical record. And so I've been reading dozens of these archaeological research papers lately while I'm writing this paper. And it turns out that the consensus among the historians of this period is that silver was used as money. And of course, this was thousands of years before coinage. And so you might think, well, how were people using silver as money even before the invention of coinage? And the answer is they used what's called hack silver. So they would actually break off little pieces of jewelry, cups, amulets, stuff like this, and they would cut it off to achieve a specific weight. And that's how they would go through with their exchanges. And every single historian of the period of this ancient Near East economy, Mesopotamia and around the Mediterranean as well, all of these primitive, semi-prehistorical, around the invention of writing, they were using silver. And one of the best evidences of this is the hack silver hoards. So you find, people stashed away a collection of this hack silver, like under the floor of their house or something. And so you might, devil's advocate might say, okay, you found this collection of silver. That doesn't prove that it's money. That's true. That's you can say that. However, what some of these archaeologists have done is they've actually looked at the weights of silver that were in these hoards, and they actually correspond to the units of weight that they had. They had, balance weights. And so it's very clear that they were breaking off these pieces of silver to achieve a specific weight. And on top of that, you have all the textual evidence. If you actually look at the translations of the clay tablets that Ray talks about, they indicate all of these transactions that involve specific weights of silver. One last thing that I'll say, and then I'll hand it back to you. We'll talk about gold in the U.S. Shift a few thousand years back. Is that an MMTer might say, okay, maybe they were collecting taxes in silver. And so our story is still right because they were collecting taxes, but in silver. But that's not the case. If you go and look at these ancient tax systems, they were all in-kind tax systems. The states would collect, a certain fraction of your crop, or especially in ancient Mesopotamia, they would collect a lot of livestock in taxes. So while the state was collecting taxes in kind, the rest of the economy was using silver in payment and as a medium of exchange. So I consider this a thorough vindication of Menger. The chartalists are wrong, the MMTers are wrong, and looking forward to presenting this paper and seeing what people think about it. Thanks for the long tangent there.
Well, I think it answers the question, right? I mean, essentially the question was why bother with the gold standard, or more broadly, why bother with physical money-based or metal-based money, right? Because you're right. I did a lengthy kind of deep dive on old history of money too, and even through the Middle Ages, right? It was still silver in most cases. Gold is more of a 18th and 19th century thing. Kind of I suppose maybe you could date it to the financial revolution in 17th century England that has started to really become common and catch on. So again, we're not saying that it has to be gold. But by the time of the late 19th and early 20th century, when we're talking about when the U.S. started to develop this complex banking system that had a lot of gold passing through it, it was gold. That was the way it had developed at that time. And that then leads us to where we are in the current situation. And also kind of drawing upon your comments, I think tells us a little bit about why the central government continues to bother with holding on to this gold, right? Like if you can always just produce more wealth for yourself by printing more money, as the MMTers would seem to imply, right? We'll just we'll issue debt. We'll use a tax policy to make people use dollars, that sort of thing. Why bother with a gold hoard at all? Why not just sell it off? Why did they sell it off a long time ago and use it to just buy some stuff? There's actually information in this if you Google phrases like, why do central banks say that they hang on to gold, right? Because there's no central banks left that back their money with gold. Not even the Swiss anymore do it. And so what justification do they give? Because most of these central banks have the big central banks have, in some cases, thousands of metric tons of gold. The U.S., assuming the numbers are true, has over 8,000. But you can look at the Germans, they have 3,000, and there's like more than 2,000 in places like France and things like that. So why do they have it? Well, they say, of course, that, it helps us as an inflation hedge and all that sort of thing. I suspect that the real reason they hold on to it is for far more fundamental issues related to the health and power and independence and sovereignty of the state, which is they know that, contrary to what MMTers would say, that there is quite a bit of assurance in having a big gold hoard. Because you know that even in case of a highly destructive war, in case of like serious big-time existential threats to the state, you know it's going to be a saleable good, if you will. And they admit this in many ways. It's called the war chest theory of why does my country keep a gold hoard? It's because they know that if the country ever gets into deep, deep trouble, they can sell off that gold to maybe finance some more military spending and that sort of thing, because they know they'll always be able to find a buyer for that. Contrary to what the MMTers may say, there's always a limit to how much you can get people to own your currency. There's always a limit to how much you can get them to buy in terms of your government debt. Because at some point that stuff really does become worthless once you overdo it in terms of its amount, that you keep flooding the market with treasuries, you keep flooding the market with dollars. The value will eventually go to zero. You can't flood the market with gold. There's only so much. And so it's always going to have a certain value. And that seems to be the real reason that the governments refuse to give up on their gold hoards, even though they claim that it has no value. We're just hanging on to the hoard for nothing. I'm sure it'll be important someday. And so I don't really buy that argument. They know that it's a sort of insurance policy for the elites where they can use this gold because they can access it, the deep state, if you will. They know they can use the gold in case of a serious crisis. So I think that's kind of why they bother with holding on to that. And that kind of brings us, I think, to the next question of, well, how much is there really? And this brings us back to the issue of, well, are the numbers accurate? And as I mentioned, right, the U.S. claims it has about 8,000 metric tons of this gold. And this is held in places, it's mostly about 56% of it is held in Fort Knox, but there's also substantial components to the hoard at the Denver Mint and at the West Point Mint. And then 5% of it is held by the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. And by the way, we've got several columns on this at Mises.org, but just to reiterate, the Federal Reserve does not own this gold. The Treasury took possession of the gold. Don't at me, bro, with stuff about how the Fed is a private organization. You can't take their gold. No, it's legislation was clear in 1934 that the gold was to be transferred from the Fed to the U.S. Treasury. That happened. It's Treasury gold. The Fed doesn't have it. The Fed owns no gold, and in fact may not even be empowered to buy gold if it wanted to. So this really isn't a Fed issue at this point when we're talking about the gold reserve.
It is really strange, though, that the Fed, they have the gold certificates on their balance sheet.
Yes, but they're only denominated in dollars. And the legislation seems clear that they can't trade the gold certificates in for actual gold. So they've really been stripped of any sort of real options in that respect. And anyone who wants more on this, I recommend look up Alex Pollock's work at Mises.org. He's kind of done some extensive work on this. And so my question for you, though, Jonathan, okay, so we've established there's all of this gold and it's a lot. And this takes us back to the issue of why even bother with the hoard of gold. I mean, when we look at the value of it, it amounts to, in today's dollars, about $750 billion. There seems to be people out there who unaware, who when they're not familiar with like budget numbers or the size of the U.S. budget, size of tax revenues and all that stuff, sometimes they talk in terms of like, well, we could use this gold to like pay off the debt, or we could use the gold to like fix the deficit or something. I mean, are we talking about amounts that matter in that? I mean, what could we really do with the gold that would help people? I mean, it doesn't seem like it would save us any real amount of money.
Yeah, it's totally insufficient to even make a sizable dent in our national debt. Of course, I'm not sure that $750 billion figure. I think that's assuming that all of it would be able to be sold at the current market price. But of course, we face downward sloping demand curves. Even for gold, right? So, which means that if you're trying to, unload all of that at the same time, then the price would decrease. So, the question, in fact, I think the reason why the gold in Fort Knox hit news headlines is because Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, was talking about monetizing U.S. assets. Like selling off U.S. assets to mitigate the size of the deficit or the national debt, and I guess some people started thinking, oh, does that mean he's going to sell off the U.S. Gold hoard? But then he quickly said, no, we're not going to do that. And then people were talking, well, people were asking, is all of the gold there? And then Scott said, yes, it is there. You just have to trust me, bro. That sort of thing. But it's not even close. So the national debt is it over $34 trillion now? Is that?
It's rapidly approaching 36, I think.
Oh my goodness! I don't have the lapel pin that Thomas Massey, that hero has. So I don't get the daily updates on it. But even if we could sell all of it for 750 billion, that's nowhere. That's like a scratch, right? That's a drop in the bucket compared to the size of our national debt. So it would not be usable in that way. It would, like I said, be a drop in the bucket. Now, one thing that the U.S. government could do to benefit Americans with this gold supply is actually work to go back to a gold standard. And if you're interested in this, you could look at this. It was a series of 3 essays that we published together. It's called "Taking Back Our Money" by Murray Rothbard. And the last essay, the third essay in that, he talks about like an actual plan to liquidate the Federal Reserve's assets. And go back to a gold standard. And of course, we would not be able to go back to anything close to the earlier exchange ratios, like what was it, $44.44.
It was 40. I think it's 42.2222
Oh, yeah, that's
is
right.
the official
right.
number.
I knew there was the repetition there. Yeah, so we definitely wouldn't be able to go back to that. But I think he said something like announce that the U.S. dollar will be redeemable for a certain amount of gold and make it based on the market price at a particular date in the future, and announce the date. And that would be a way to get back to the U.S. dollar being on a gold standard. Of course, this is politically infeasible. There's no way that this is going to happen. But if we're going to talk about thought experiments, what could the U.S. government do with the gold? That would be one good thing. Of course, another good thing would be to get out of printing dollars in the first place and just auction off the gold supply. That would be good.
Yeah, it seems that there's a few different ways you could do it. You probably know it better than me. I know that Doug French took part of Rothbard's old plan of remonetizing gold and looked at how Rothbard had run some numbers on how you might remonetize gold back when Rothbard was alive. So we're talking 30 years ago or more, and how much worse the situation is now, even than 30 years ago. Because when Rothbard was running the numbers, right, the official number of $42 per ounce, a devaluation in itself, that was, I believe, the 1973 number that they came up with after the Nixon shock and all of that stuff. It had been $35 an ounce, which itself was a devaluation after FDR's gold theft. And obviously, that's a joke number now, as you note, right? The current market price is more like 1900. And so if Rothbard kind of ran the numbers as to what the numbers were back then, which I think was more like, say, $400 an ounce or something. And so the amount of gold, of course, per dollar, if we were going to value the dollar, taking into account the number of dollars in circulation and the amount of gold that exists in the gold reserves, obviously you're talking about a teeny tiny amount of gold per dollar that is available. But even that would probably be preferable, right? I mean, the market could adjust to that, right? Yeah, there was no rule that's saying the dollar had to be defined in X number. Because right back in the 19th century, what all these countries were doing was they were defining their national currency as an amount of gold. And it wasn't an exchange rate. It wasn't like, this is the amount of dollars you can get for this amount of gold. It was simply a definition. It was, we just decided this is what it's worth. So you could define it as anything, right? You could define it as 1/1,000,000th of an ounce if you want per dollar. And it seems that the economy would be perfectly easy and able to adjust to that reality. And so why not? I don't see how economically, you point out, right, politically you can't do that. They're not going to want to do that because that would immediately then start to impose limitations.
Severe limitations.
On the ability to just inflate away whatever that is. Suddenly people would start thinking of dollar in terms of a specific amount of gold, and that would be a whole different ball game, even if it was a minuscule amount of gold. But you could do it. I mean, I don't see why not in terms of economic terms. We would have to get over this idea of the fact that gold was worth some smallish number, 50, 100, 200. All those are joke numbers at this point. It would just be like probably like a 7-digit number or something like that in terms of the dollar to the amount of gold.
I don't think that would be, too much of a psychological problem, because our minds aren't thinking in terms of, how much gold could you get when you bring your dollar into a bank in the 1800s, right? Of course, how do we think about the relationship between the dollar and gold today? And that's through its market price. So like you take $100 bill and you try to go buy as much gold as you can. That's closer to the exchange ratio that would be achieved by this sort of plan, which I think we're already psychologically, primed for that sort of that exchange ratio, since it is the current market price.
Yeah, and I think that would be all to the good to do that, even if it was this minuscule amount of money per dollar, because I think it would achieve two things, right? It would start to privatize this gold hoard, which really just exists there as a slush fund in my mind for the elites, right? Things start to turn real bad. There's civil unrest in America. Americans are refusing to pay their taxes. The military is refusing to take, or let's think of like late Soviet Union sort of stuff, which is, even if you deeply love America and think it's eternal, I can assure you it is not eternal, and things will break down at some point. So when the regime starts to fear for its existence, thank goodness it has that gold hoard to fall back on and buy more weapons and maybe even mercenaries to shoot Americans who are refusing to pay their taxes or take orders, that sort of thing. This is how states come to an end in the real world, and it really does help out the regime in power if it has just an extra saleable gold hoard somewhere. So I think we should take away the power of the regime to directly control gold that way. Should be privatized. But as you say, right, and I haven't mentioned this in any of my articles, but it's an absolutely important point. If you just start selling off all of that $750 billion hoard at once, the per dollar per ounce rate you could get would immediately start to fall, because you're essentially flooding the market with huge amounts of gold. Rather, it would seem a more reasonable thing would be to just decide, okay, we've got, I believe the last time I checked using the Austrian measure of the money supply, which is about $19 trillion in circulation, according to the Austrian money supply measure. So you would have to do some arithmetic to figure out, okay, we've got $19 trillion in circulation, and we have 261 million troy ounces of gold, I believe is the number. Do some arithmetic and figure out what that is per dollar. And I think you would want to do the maximum amount of dollars that you could, right? Because you don't want to immediately then be faced with some sort of like, oh, well, we've got to run on the banks now because there's many more dollars in circulation than there is gold banking. You want to definitely cover all the dollars that you could think of that are around. And so if you do that, yeah, I think you're right. People would just immediately start to think in terms of that, and it would take that gold slowly out of the hands of the regime, because it wouldn't immediately exit the reserve. It would start to exit the reserve as people started to exchange their dollars for actual gold. And you would probably have to do some sort of like base metal coin where there was this tiny little amount of gold in the coin. Or there's that thing that some of those like little gold organizations do where it's like paper money with like a little bit of gold woven into it.
Yeah, the gold foil. Those are cool. They're called goldbacks. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's no reason you couldn't do that. We have the technology to distribute the gold in tiny amounts, is what we're saying. And then, who would rob the state of this asset that they hold on to and don't let anybody even look at, apparently. So it seems that that's something that could be done. And it sounds like Rothbard would have been on board with that sort of thing. It sounds like he kind of tried to develop some sort of plan for that.
Yeah. Of course, I'll be the Debbie Downer here. It's politically impossible. I mean, it would take like this, crazy sort of crisis event combined with a huge change in public opinion, politicians' incentives. So I wouldn't say totally impossible, but I mean, this is not something that's going to, pass the House next week, right? It's worth emphasizing why. And the reason why is because the government likes to spend, and the government likes to spend way more than it collects in taxes. And that's the primary way that new money enters the economy. outside of the banking system. You've alluded to fractional reserve banking a little bit, but the way that the Federal Reserve creates new money is by buying government debt. So it buys government debt from these primary dealers, and it does so with newly printed money. Of course, it's not literally printed, so don't at me, bro, on that. Some people say, the Federal Reserve doesn't actually print this. I know. But that, and so the reason why the Fed prints so much is because the U.S. keeps running these massive deficits, and the reason they have these massive deficits is because government spending is through the roof and taxes are unpopular, right? So if we went back to balanced budgets, it's difficult to see how there could be huge changes in the money supply. But of course, a balanced budget, even that is politically impossible. That's like as far fetched as going back to a gold standard these days. So
just to make it like,
dream.
I mean, I just want to make it as kind of like the final comment. Just like explain to me, like I'm 5 years old, why. Defining the dollar again as some amount of gold, no matter how small, why would connecting the dollar to gold again limit the government's ability then to spend freely? How does that mechanism work? Because I don't think that's clear to everybody.
Sure. If they spend more than they collect in taxes, they run a deficit, which means they have to borrow. When they borrow, they sell debt to private financial institutions, private investors, people who want to purchase government debt. And then some of those financial institutions turn around and sell the debt to the Federal Reserve. So there's a little bit of a shell game going on. If you want to make it, quick and dirty, you could say the Federal Reserve just buys the government's debt. And when they do that with newly printed money. So the way that the U.S. government is able to expropriate real resources from the economy is not just through taxes taken out of your paycheck each month. It's also through making new green pieces of paper. It's through making new units of the currency, and of course everybody understands this. Or most people, if you make more of these things, make more dollars, then that's going to cause prices to rise. And so you don't just pay your taxes in the form of the IRS taking money out of your paycheck. You also pay taxes to the government indirectly through the so-called inflation tax. And so that the reason why it is a tax is because it's the government uses the newly printed money to take things out of the private economy, take real resources out of the private economy, out of private owners' hands. And so it's the same thing as taxes. It's like there's a shell game going on, and so we don't immediately recognize it, and the effects are complex and they're delayed, and so there's not as much of an uproar when the Federal Reserve prints up new money, when there would be a huge uproar if they tried to raise those taxes directly, right? So. What did I answer your question somewhere? I lost the original question.
Well, the reason they can't print, so they would be limited in the ability to print if people thought of the dollar in terms of a specific amount of gold.
Yeah. So if the dollar were redeemable for a certain weight of gold, if the U.S. government attempted to do that sort of thing, if they tried to print money to pay to purchase debt, right, then there would be increase in the supply of these pieces of paper. People would go to redeem them for the gold, and eventually all of the gold would leave the government's coffers. And that's exactly what was happening pre-1971 on an international scale. All of these other countries were coming to the United States, say, hey, we've got these U.S. dollars. We'd like the gold that you promised us. But if we went back to a gold standard, we'd have the same sort of thing. It's just that now even private citizens would be able to redeem their dollars for gold, and so all of the gold would leave the system. And if it would leave the government's ownership, the government's coffers, not leave the economic system entirely. And you'd have depending on how much was printed, you could have like a hyperinflationary situation where people just totally abandon the paper and they go to some alternative currency. In this sort of thought experiment that we're talking about, they'd likely just switch to physical gold.
All right. Well, I mean, there you go. That explains why Even though it is certainly economically possible to privatize this gold, politically, right, neither party is going to even remotely go for that.
It's a severe constraint on the size and scope of government, which is a reason why limited government people like the gold standard. It's not a lot of people will say that people who like the gold standard, they like it just because they have this sort of weird fascination with gold, like we like shiny objects or something. But the main reason why I'm in favor of a gold standard is because it severely constrains what the government can do. It means that there's really no way for them to increase spending unless they also increase taxes, and increasing taxes is extremely unpopular, right? So this is a huge, wonderful constraint on how big the government can be.
Well, and we don't have that constraint anymore, right? This is how governments have become so huge in the 20th century. A major important innovation from the state's perspective, right, to vastly increase its own power. And they got away with it, I think, because a lot of people, I mean, Rothbard likes to talk about how in the 19th century, it was amazing. You would see all these newspapers designed for ordinary working class Americans, certainly not people with college degrees, debating things like the bimetallism and the price of gold versus the price of silver and the effects of changes in the banking system. All that. This was stuff that like coal miners were reading in the 19th century when in terms of politics and political debate. But man, have we come a long way from that, and I think that's part of why the government is able to get away with this ongoing ripoff that most people either don't care about or don't understand. So, well, with that cheery thought, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining me today. We will be back next week with more, so we'll see you next time. One last thing, Radio Rothbard listeners, you might be interested in our upcoming Revisionist History of War Conference. That's coming May 15 through 17 at our Mises Institute campus in Auburn, Alabama. We've got an exciting lineup of Misesian and Rothbardian speakers. This includes Colonel Douglas McGregor, USS Liberty survivor Phil Tourney, many others, plus me, yours truly, Ryan McMaken. I'll be speaking there as well. And war, right? It's if we look at the great history of hardcore free market, classical liberals and libertarians, universally among them was opposition to war and the warfare state going back 200 years. And so this is a chance to look also at some of that scholarship and also look at how the regime has pushed for more war in recent years and how that has helped the ruling classes in many ways. So you can register for this. If you're a member, it's $300. Non-member registration is $325. You can go do that now at Mises.org/RHW. That's Mises.org/RHW.